Canada. And today we're going to talk about her work, her research, about the work in particular that she's going to be presenting and talking about the vestibular system. And that course begins next Thursday at the same time. It begins at 3 p.m. Eastern time. It may vary depending on where you are. Today we're going to talk about her work, her research, about the work in particular that she's going to be presenting and talking about the vestibular system. Let's see. And that course begins. So that was interesting. So that is what it sounds like on the live stream, and now you know. We're gonna do. I have a handful of questions that I would like to ask Dr. Lanius. I'm gonna start by asking her to talk a little bit about what she would like to talk about today, and then at the end we'll have some time for general questions. There are a number of people who have worked with Ruth and have worked in trauma in particular that are on the call. So typically when we do these, it is a lively conversation. So we'll start with those comments first. Ruth, Dr. Lanius, would you like to start with introduction? Okay. Yeah. Would you like to start by talking about why the vestibular system? It seems rather random for somebody who's not studied trauma and that area.
Sure. And first of all, hi everyone. It's nice to see you again, or it's nice to see you, and hope you're all well and staying safe during these difficult times. And yeah, let's talk about why the vestibular system. It may seem odd at first, but I think when we think about trauma and what our clients present with, we all know that we just see the tip of the iceberg, right? That so much in the aftermath of trauma is at the subliminal or subconscious level. There's all this stuff going on that our clients are not aware of. And the vestibular system plays a really key role in multisensory processing. So processing the internal and the external world. And we know how the processing of the internal and the external world is so affected by trauma. For example, we know our patients often feel like they're being eaten alive inside by shame, or they always feel on edge, or they feel dead inside. So the internal world is very much affected. And of course, the external world is very much affected. How we see the world, I can't trust other people. The world will never feel safe again. And of course, those two things are very interrelated. And the balance, or the vestibular system, really lays a foundation in the processing of both the internal and the external world. And it begins deep within the reptilian brain, but it has connections to areas that process the internal world, for example, the insula, so that processes those visceral sensory feelings within our body, and then later they reach our awareness. But it also helps us through its connections to process the outside world and our relationship with the outside world. And we know that a lot of our patients are very much affected by this, especially if they have a lot of dissociative symptoms. So often our patients are very clumsy. They don't know where they begin and where they end, and they don't really know where they are in space. And then the processing of the internal world and the external world then gets passed on to the prefrontal cortex. And that's an area of the brain that helps us to have a sense of agency, that helps us to connect, that helps us to think and to plan, and to have a narrative of what we've experienced. And we also know that, of course, through our clinical experience, that this part of the brain, this frontal part of the cortex, is often offline. So that's often disconnected and it's not firing adequately. And I would say that that's really related to some of the clinical difficulties that we see, such as that our patients lack a sense of agency. They lack that executive functioning, right? That ability to maintain attention, to have good working memory, to really plan, have a future. But they also have significant difficulties connecting to others, right? Which is also a critical part of that frontal cortex. And so when we go back to the reptilian part of the brain very early on in development, that structure, especially the part that deals with balance, the vestibular system, connects to all these higher systems. So the system that processes the inner world, the outer world, and where all this gets integrated to help us have a sense of agency, executive functioning, ability to connect, and have language. And so, of course, when that's offline, when that prefrontal cortex is offline, we've all experienced that doing talking therapies or cognitive therapies that are really directed at that front part of the brain are difficult, right? And we've all been frustrated. Of course, we're all trained in those therapies and they're critical, but how can we think about, interventions for trauma when that frontal cortex goes offline? And how can we intervene from bottom up? And really, ideally, how can we combine top-down therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamic approaches and bottom-up therapies that, for example, would intervene by changing sensory input. So by, for example, getting somebody to feel something that feels soothing to them, or listening to music that feels soothing to them, or listening to music that would change their mood into a more, brighter emotional response. Or how can we use the vestibular system? Can we use, for example, individuals engaging in rocking? How can we use that to change those higher brain structures and bring those brain structures online so the individual knows what they're feeling, they know where they are in space, and then finally those upper brain structures can come online that give them a sense of agency, a sense of connection, and really a sense of being able to have a narrative to their experience. So I think that's my answer in a nutshell. Sorry it was so long.
Great. Great, thank you. So I didn't do really an introduction, partly because I wanted to jump right into the topic itself. But you are one of the preeminent researchers of particularly trauma and clinical approaches to addressing trauma, therapeutic approaches, and so on. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when you describe the brain regions that are affected by, by sensory processing difficulties and trauma and so on. Is that by fMRI scan? Can you talk a little bit about how you all know what areas are doing what?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the way we study trauma in our group is we always start with our patients. So we always start with the first person experience of somebody who suffered trauma. And that really allows us to ask a number of questions. And the way this research first started with the vestibular system is actually because a lot of our patients told us how clumsy they feel, that they keep bumping into things, that they don't know where they are in space. A lot of them are disembodied, right? Or they have out-of-body responses, or the world around them feels unreal. So they're really not connected to the world. They don't feel grounded in this world, and they don't feel grounded in their body. And I think that really plays a role in that feeling of instability. And so, I was talking to our group and, I said, we really need to study this balance system. And so 𝗕𝗹 𝗥𝗲𝗰𝗲, who graduated with her PhD, took on this work. And we started by looking at what areas of the brain in the vestibular system get activated when somebody is just lying in the scanner at rest off task. And what we found through this, and of course the vestibular system or the balance system is always active, right? You don't have to engage in a task, but that system always needs to be active because we always need a sense of balance, whether we lie down or whether we sit up or whether we're walking around. And so we really found profound disconnections in that system that helped to us to understand how processing both the internal as well as the external world may be very much affected by trauma, and also how this system may contribute to this loss of agency, this loss of thinking, this loss of connection, and this inability to completely form a narrative around the traumatic experience.
That's great. So, and one of the exciting things, just as a reference, there are, the last look that it's upwards of 150 scholarly articles that are produced by your lab that you are leading in the research, something along those lines, right? So there's quite a body at this point of evidence. So when we say that, I'm just referencing that, but when we talk about evidence-based, that's what the evidence shows. And to me, one of the most exciting things is that it shows sort of clinical success. Can you talk a little bit about when you're doing this research? You know, it's so different from, like, you know, I don't know, an anatomical research where you're dissecting, you know, animals on a table or whatever. You know, the approach is an extremely empowering one for the people who come to see you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And I think what we bring to our work is that we bring the resilience of our patients to the work, but we also bring the suffering of our patients to the work. And I think what's been so helpful for our patients is that it has helped, this whole neuroimaging field, I think, has helped to make an invisible injury visible, right? And so often they've been treated poorly in the mental health care system. You know, they were told, you know, it's all in your head. Of course, it's in your head and your body, but you know how we mean that. And so I think to see those alterations in activation of the brain, in connectivity of the brain, and also in the structure of the brain as a result of trauma has been incredibly validating. And I think what's brought even more hope is that, you know, with treatments, the field has started to show that we can reverse some of those changes, right? So that we can restore that brain functioning. And of course, we also know that we can restore functioning from a clinical perspective and a quality of life perspective. And so I think that's brought an incredible amount of hope to patients as well. And I know they love coming, and they really feel validated. And we have several dozen patients who keep returning for different studies.
That's great. One of the things that I find personally challenging is that there's a difference in the sort of way that this understanding of the process of sort of learning to thrive and learning to function and learning to regulate, self-regulate, and so on. And it seems to me that some of it is that this sense of, you know, I grew up with an understanding that, you know, memory is something about things that happened in the past. And from what I understand of the work that you're showing is that, particularly for, and this may be not news at all to people who are on this call that do a lot of work with trauma, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the aspects of recovering from trauma that have to do with sort of unconscious or subconscious triggers, and, you know, the sense of time and how that relates to this topic of balance system and vestibular system.
Absolutely.
Ruth, before you answer this brilliant question, is there any way to up your volume? There are several people on the chat saying they're having a hard time hearing.
I'm at max for my volume.
Okay. Is there anything you can do, Lars?
There isn't, I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's all in the tubes.
I'll try to project my voice more. I hope that helps. Yeah, so I think these are key questions, Lars, and obviously that could be a whole webinar on its own, but I think what we haven't thought enough about is this whole implicit memory, right? What we're thinking about is explicit memory, conscious memory, right? memory that we can express in words. That's usually what we think about memory. But I think in individuals with post-traumatic stress, there's also a lot of implicit memories. And of course, the memories are often in a sensory form, and individuals don't have the prefrontal cortex activation to put a narrative to the traumatic experience. And the prefrontal cortex is also one of the areas, together with the insula and the hippocampus, that is critical for us to have a sense of time and context of the experience. And so that goes offline. And so the traumatic memories seem to be recalled from the back part of the brain in the form of timeless sensations, right? And so traumatic memory is not really recalled, but it's relived. And so I think that's important to be aware of. And I think what we really need to study now is these implicit memories. And I always remember this one case I saw a few years ago. I saw a woman who was involved in a severe car accident, and she had no memory of this car accident. And she was only told about the accident. And one thing she was told about was that she was transported by helicopter to a tertiary care center where she was treated. And then she came to see me for her assessment, and she reported that she really had no memory of this accident and that she was transported by helicopter. And as we were talking about the trauma story, I was on the 10th floor at that time. Near the helicopter landing pad, a helicopter flew in to land at our hospital. And as this helicopter was coming in, she started to shake and become incredibly anxious, even though she had no conscious or explicit memory of the experience. It triggered the lower part of her brain, the reptilian brain, and really activated her. And so I think that's a critical question for us to answer, is how is memory processed in those lower brain structures? We have a good idea how it's processed in the higher brain structures, but how is it processed in the lower brain structures? And I think a lot of confusion has arisen in the field as a result of this, especially in the recovered memory field. I don't think there are recovered memories. I think what is recovered is the explicit recall. But I think all memories, or almost all memories, are encoded. But I think some of them are much more encoded on this implicit sensory level. So I think that's really going to be a key question. And the question how the balance system may or may also play a role in that, I think, is also critical. Because when we think about, sometimes when we do trauma processing with people who've been extremely physically abused or who were involved in an accident, that vestibular system or that balance system is activated again, right? And they often experience severe dizziness while we process that trauma. And so, a big question, I think, is how is this balance system is or not involved in also encoding and retrieving of those subconscious memories or the implicit memories, I think is really important.
That's great. That it resonates with a lot of the conversation that that I've heard from many different areas that are of therapists that are working with trauma, Bruce Perry and Peter Levine and so on. In particular, this idea that what you're describing is a kind of embodiment, that it's that the person's behavior and living has much more to do with how they are in their body than explicitly just like what their thoughts are. Is that accurate? Okay.
And of course, the two influence each other, right? I think what we think and what we feel, and I think we have to get emotion into this as well, right? There's very few thoughts, without, an emotional component when you think about trauma. So how are thoughts, emotion, and bodily reactions related? Right? And how can we influence them top down? And how can we influence thoughts and emotions from bottom up, right? And how can we work elegantly from both top down and bottom up to really help our patients maximally?
Okay. Thank you. So, and the new course that will begin next week, you did a 6-week course on trauma development and neuroplasticity, easier for me to say, where you explored brain networks and major brain networks and how they're affected by trauma and so on. Can you talk a little bit about how this new course relates to that other course and what you know, what people who are signed up to take this new one can look forward to?
Yeah, I think it's sort of expanding some areas that we didn't have enough time to cover in the last course. And one is the balanced vestibular system. We covered it very briefly, but I think here we're going to really expand talking about the balance system, how that relates to where our bodies are in space and how we interact with the external world, and how that also relates how we perceive our internal world, and how this then forms the basis of multisensory integration at the level of the cortex that allows us to regulate ourselves, to connect, to have a narrative, and to have a sense of agency. So we'll really talk about that in detail, and then also dive more into detailed therapeutic options, both emotion regulation options using sensations or sensory input, but also how can we use, for example, the vestibular system in trauma processing, how the vestibular system may bring that front part of the brain online that is really critical for trauma processing. So some methods how to do that. And then I'm hoping to also discuss a new technique that has been developed by Frank Corrigan that really deals with trauma processing, focusing on the orienting response. So whenever we're faced with a traumatic trigger or a trauma, the first thing we do is to orient to that trigger, right? So to figure out where we are in relationship to that trigger or that trauma. And that is before actually we experience the emotions or the raw affect that go with that trauma. And Frank is very elegantly developing a neuroscientifically guided intervention that really focuses on trauma processing, really centered at the orienting response. And we're currently doing a study on that. And what it's showing is that it's a very titrated way of processing trauma because we're focusing on the orienting response, which goes with, you know, certain neck tensions or jaw tensions or other facial tensions because we orient with the head. So it's really focusing on those orienting responses with regard to what happens in the head and neck, and really focusing on that and not on the affect or the emotion that can often be very overwhelming for people. And both, of course, the balance system, but also the cerebellum that is going to be part of this webinar are critical to this orienting response. And so we'll be talking quite in detail about that as well, how we can actually use that for trauma processing and how can we titrate that in a way that it's really accessible and tolerable for more people.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you. And you talked a little bit about we've been talking about what the course is for. And one question that we get a lot is this appropriate mostly for people who are postdoctoral students in psychological research? or can someone else who is interested in trauma, in recovery, who is, feels empowered by the kind of research and the sorts of things that you're talking about, is this course appropriate for them?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think this course is all about recovery. This course is all about, individuals who suffer from trauma and how we can help them to recover. And I think what this course is about is really neuroscientifically guided treatments, right? How can these brain abnormalities, and I don't like actually the word abnormality because I think the brain adapted to a horrible environment, right? So how can those brain adaptations be changed to now the present, where hopefully the individual is beginning to feel safe. So how can the brain adapt from an unsafe to a safer environment? I think this is what this course is all about.
That's great. Thank you. And I have one more question, and then maybe we can ask other folks what their questions are. I know there are a couple in the chat. That is what, it's sort of a wild question. What do you feel like is in your conversations with people, and when in your reading, you know, online and stuff, what is least understood about these areas that you're talking about? What are the things, where do people really steer wrong when it comes to an understanding of trauma and the way the brain is organized? I know it's a huge topic. You write 6 books about these questions alone. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you wish that people understood a little bit better.
I think we're just starting to understand these deep reptilian brain structures and how, you know, our processing of internal and external sensations is critical to the experience of post-traumatic stress. And very few people work in that paradigm at the present time. You know, certainly the neurofeedback therapists understand this. The expressive art therapists understand this. And Cathy 𝗕𝗹 in her book, for example, writes about this. And so, and of course, the occupational therapists, you know, they have understood this model for years, but they've been separated from mental health care very often. And I think it's absolutely critical that we bring this multisensory processing, to which, you know, the balance system and the cerebellum is critical, online, so we can really target, you know, specific interventions from bottom up and really combine them elegantly with top-down interventions.
Okay, thank you. So 𝗕𝗿 𝗥𝗲𝗰𝗄, the fourth one of the course, the fourth session, is going to be a conversation between you and 𝗕𝗿 𝗥𝗲𝗰𝗄, who also has done decades of work and is a published author on trauma and recovery. 𝗕𝗿, I wonder if I could invite you to join us and ask if you have anything to add or questions to ask of Ruth along those lines.
Well, you should warn me because every time I'm asked to come on, I have been thinking, doing something else, and I've been on a back chat with Cathy 𝗕𝗿. So, you know, I think one of the other things that gets in the way of people understanding the reality of trauma is not really understanding that it's in the brain at all. Really understand that having an idea that this is a problem of the mind or the psyche or the, you know, that has no root in the brain except possibly something vaguely chemical. And I think when Ruth said, we're getting to see that you can reverse some of the damage done by trauma, what she's showing in her most recent paper is that you can reverse that damage with neurofeedback. You can reverse the patterning of the brain with giving it a view of itself through neurofeedback. So, you know, I mean, there are a lot of ways to go about this, and I just think we can't leave the brain out, and this direct conversation with the brain, or this direct interface, or allowing it to interface with itself, is so profound. And it's really outside of the realm of any other thing that I've ever engaged in, either as a trauma therapist or a trauma survivor.
I couldn't agree with you more, 𝗕𝗿.
Yeah. So Ruth, I was wanting to know, and this may just be too specific, but you know, all of these systems I know are connected, but your work is really focusing a great deal, the work that we're looking at in your paper on the PAG, on the periaqueductal gray and the brainstem. And I'm just wondering how the PAG and the vestibular system relate to one another in the modeling that you're seeing, or in the results that you're seeing, if that's something you could talk about.
That's a great question, and that's still something we're trying to figure out. And we would, of course, hypothesize that they're tightly connected, but our neuroimaging methodology is still not the best to look at the brainstem. So we're still finding it very difficult to look at how the different connections are really playing out in the brainstem. But we know that, sensory information that comes from the outside world enters the brain at the level of the superior colliculus, at the midbrain, again, reptilian brain, which is very tightly connected to the periaqueductal gray. We know that the balance or vestibular system is intricately involved in processing the external information. So there has to be a relationship between the balance system and the periaqueductal gray superior colliculus system. And they also project to some of the same areas in the higher levels of the brain. And so I think this is really how external and internal information gets combined and really gets processed at the highest level in the prefrontal cortex. And that's what makes us human, and that gives us that sense of agency and that capacity to connect and play.
Great, thank you.
Maybe I'll pull from some of the chat questions, if you're open to that. And
Sure.
𝗕𝗹, I apologize for pulling you in.
That's no worry.
Okay, good. I'm just going to start at the end, actually. You measure activity in the midbrain, especially the superior colliculus and PAG. I'm interested, as I've recently learned DBR with Frank Corrigan.
Yeah, and that's, Frank's whole theory behind this treatment, focusing on the orienting response. That's the location where this all starts. And so this sensory information, so when we see something in the environment, it comes directly from the retina to the superior colliculus. Sensory information such as touch, the superior colliculus also has a little body map where we can register touch. It's not nearly as sophisticated as the body map in the somatosensory strip in the cortex, but it does have a little body map, and it also processes auditory information, and it does so very quickly so we can respond. And it directs these innate reflexive functionings. And that's really what we need for trauma. And so Frank's deep brain reorienting trauma processing focuses on that orienting response that really is initiated by the reptilian brain, specifically the superior colliculus. And the cerebellum plays a role in that as well. And yeah, we'll deal with how to process trauma, really focusing on the orienting response and titrating that in the webinar on the cerebellum.
Thank you. Cathy, I don't know how this last name is pronounced, 𝗕𝗹. Am I saying that anywhere close? Would you care to actually state sort of where your questioning is? Because I see several comments, and I'm afraid I will entirely mangle your area of inquiry.
Hi, Cathy.
You want me to put my video on?
Yes.
Sure, that would be great.
And sparkling lights in back of me. Sorry. It's an expressive therapist. No, when Ruth said, and Ruth and I have been having a lot of conversations, right?
Yeah.
About these things. And I come from an expressive arts background as a psychologist. So I think about it, operationalizing it to things that people can do in an action-oriented way, right? So this whole thing is so exciting to me because we have a model that was developed in the late 70s. But of course, back then, there was not all this information we have now about how the brain functions. We couldn't look into the brain in the way we can look into it now. But it's a somatosensory bottom-up approach. So somatosensory to affective, we know emotional, and to cognitive. And this is the way we've been working with, flying in the blind, essentially, because we didn't have the brain science until, the last decade or so, to really start to figure out like why this actually seemed to work, right? And there are studies now in the military, I don't want to go on too long here, but in some of the facilities where they have a large population of military who have post-traumatic stress, I've been able to work with them through this process of starting at that level through engaging them in expressive work. So it could be image making, it can be music, can be movement. There's a lot of different things, but it's a 4-week program. And they've actually found, looking at fMRI, that there's a reconnection there with the language in different kinds of ways. So there's something that happens. They don't know yet what it is, but they've got enough data that shows that. But I'm always on the thing about, I think, all these wonderful methods that are innovative, like neurofeedback and some of the other things that are related, we have a different piece that we put into it, which is enlivenment of the body. It's action oriented. So I think there's a continuum here, and I'm really excited to see how like all these things go together, that people can have all these pieces together, because the dissociative thing that Ruth mentioned, that's the thing. I get a lot of people, they're dead in their body. So, they need the neurofeedback. They need some of these other things, but they need to feel alive again. They need to feel playful. They need to reconnect with their imagination too. And the imagination gets shut down. I think that's another piece of this somewhere. It gets shut down by trauma because it's scary to go there. Who wants to imagine that helicopter that you were talking about, right? Yeah. So this stuff, it's interesting. I came from an art background. How can I be so excited about this? Because it helps everything that I've been doing for decades make such sense. Yeah. Anyway, I will take my blinking lights off the screen.
Thanks, Cathy.
It's
Thanks
an
so
ice
much.
storm here. I need blinking lights.
I hear that. Thank you. Thanks so much for jumping in here. Other questions, other comments? There was someone who actually just asked about whether this is related to sensory motor psychotherapy. And I think that's sort of what Cathy was talking about, and you've talked a little bit about that. I wonder if you could elucidate a little bit about what the process of therapy for someone who comes into the clinic for you, what it looks like. What can they expect if they come in to your clinic as an experience?
Sure, and I think, of course, we start off with a really thorough assessment, and we really identify what the person is struggling most in the present. And so we come up, with a hierarchy of difficulties, and then what we really try to do is personalize the approach, and really using a combination of top-down and bottom-up treatments to really help the individual to heal. And that, really goes from anything from a bit of psychodynamic work, cognitive behavioral therapy, DBT, neurofeedback, and then some of the bottom-up therapies. We use sensory motor approaches, somatic experiencing approaches, Liz Warner's SMART therapy, and some expressive art therapy as well. A lot of my patients, draw their experiences, track their progress, through really depicting, how they view their sense of self through drawing or through collage work. And so, yeah, we really try to use an integrative approach and bring all these approaches together, because the patients that I see usually have failed a number of the mainstream first-line evidence-based treatments. And they've often been in hospital for many months or years. They're often the highest users of the mental health care system. And so I think the only way to really make some gains is really working with this integrative approach. And I think it's a lot of fun for both the patients and the therapist. And I think it's really an environment that both can thrive. And I think that's really critical to achieve recovery.
Great, thank you. Here's a question. Will the focus of the course be on recovery for adults, or will you also be talking about children and youth?
I'm an adult psychiatrist. I don't work with children. You know, certainly when we talk about some of the sensory approaches, we will also be talking about children, but it's going to focus on 16 and up.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I think certainly some of the approaches are, of course, very applicable for kids, right?
Right. And as a reference to past courses, there is almost always participants in the course who work with adolescents and youth. And so lively discussion always ensues about what the application is for those other populations. And it brings to mind the question, this has come up before, and I wonder if you have any further thoughts about it in terms of the diversity of populations, because it, you know, what seems to have been coming out more is that the experience of trauma is different based on cultural context, presentation, gender, and so on. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, or if the, you know, about a research direction or areas that need to be taken a look at.
Absolutely. And our group is really focusing on several projects right now, looking at minority stress and the intersectionality of minority stress. And I think when we think about some of the sensory-based approaches, especially in people from a different culture who aren't as familiar with the English language, some of those sensory approaches may be really appropriate. I'm currently working with a resident in London, Ontario, actually, who is working with the Yazidi population, immigrant population to London. And, you know, their English isn't fully online. And so we're actually using some of these sensory-based approaches, and we're hoping that this will be a way of really connecting with those individuals, because working from a language-based approach wouldn't be feasible.
That's great, thank you. And then there is a question here about HRV, which makes me think that one thing that we haven't talked about at all today is the way that the polyvagal theory, 𝗕𝗹 𝗥𝗄𝗺 work, kind of underlies a lot of this thinking in terms of the vagal brake and so on. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. The question in particular is, have you used HRV, heart rate variability, to assess nervous system health as well as progress with trauma treatments for survivors?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great question. And of course, all those structures in the reptilian brain come together and really influence the vagus nerve, and that's how the internal and the external world can really have an effect on what's happening in the body, which of course the vagus nerve does. And our group has looked at heart rate variability in traumatized individuals. And we know that heart rate variability is a really good index of emotion regulation and also physical health. And one finding that I found particularly interesting was a study that we did where we exposed people to both conscious and subconscious personalized trauma triggers. So people wrote down a number of words that reminded them of their own trauma. And for the conscious triggers, we exposed them long enough so they were consciously aware of the trauma trigger. And for the subconscious exposure, they only saw the word for about 14 milliseconds, which wasn't enough for them to be consciously aware. And when we exposed them to the trauma triggers in this subconscious way, this really quick way where they weren't consciously aware, that actually affected heart rate variability more. So heart rate variability was decreased more, which makes sense in a way, right? If you have no control over a trigger, you're not even aware of it, you would be more affected by it because it would be more distressing. And so, you know, HRV is a very important indicator. And of course, also in treatment, it's something that we help individuals to increase. And often that's associated with increased emotion regulation capacities. And that's really the connection between the brain and the body. And of course, the vagus nerve is so important with that.
Thank you. I'm always impressed at how easily you're able to answer these questions in such a scholarly fashion, as if you had had a couple of hours to prepare to answer the question. So it's really wonderful. It's a real pleasure to be doing this. Here's the question. Just to keep the level of challenge going on, this person is asking about the sort of elephant in the room, which is the pandemic.
Yes.
With all of the cognitive issues related to post-COVID long haulers, is the fMRI showing specific areas of brain impacted by COVID? And does it inform what can be done to heal the brain as a result of COVID, i.e. brain fog, brain fatigue, confusion, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question and a very important one. And I think the research is still in its early stages, but what we're learning is that people seem to have these micro strokes, and then they have these, and these micro strokes can be in various brain areas. Then they have these difficulties with taste and smell that often take a long time to heal. And I think, these different neurological symptoms will require different treatment. But for example, I would love to do neurofeedback with some of the people who really have cognitive difficulties, who have that brain fog, who can't remember, who have difficulty with short-term memory, they can't focus. I mean, what some of the people are reporting is almost like an onset of post-COVID dementia, right? And I think a critical question is going to be, how reversible is this? And what are some of the optimum strategies that we can use? And I'm also very interested in this change in sense of smell and sense of taste, which for some people who began having it in March has not fully recovered. And so what is exactly the underlying mechanism, and how can we deal with that, I think will be a really important question.
That's great. There were a few questions where people were asking about sort of small t trauma, areas, stress, stress resilience and tolerance, and just sort of in general. And I think this is related even for people who have not survived COVID and who have, the consequences of that. There clearly is a trauma-like outcome from just being in isolation and in a pandemic. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what does that relate to the vestibular and the cerebellar systems at all? Do you have any thoughts about what embodiment therapy looks like for people who are dealing with those kinds of small t traumas?
Absolutely, and I think it's such an important issue to really think about attachment, right? How different forms of insecure attachment at the foundation, with then bigger T traumas exposed on top, can lead to really significant problems. And the attachment problems, of course, alone, and small T traumas such as emotional abuse can lead to, severe post-traumatic reactions, even though, it doesn't officially meet criterion A, but it lays the attachment and, of course, the caregiver infant-child relationship lays the foundation for emotion regulation, emotional awareness, how we connect to others, and really what type of sense of self we have and how we view ourselves in the world. And so that very much relates, of course, to the balance system, because that's what helps us to process the inner and the outer world. And how is all this triggered by the pandemic? So when we think about how do we feel in the pandemic, we feel alone, we feel helpless, we feel isolated, and things are totally unpredictable, right? We don't know where this pandemic is going to go. And when we think about all those things, they really resemble early life trauma, right? Things are unpredictable, you're isolated, you're alone, and you feel completely helpless. And so I think those feelings that we have during the pandemic, if we have a history of childhood trauma, directly feeds into that, right? And so those feelings that we had as kids are really reactivated because of the pandemic. And I think it's really important to be aware of and really think about how much is caused by the early experiences we had and how much is really happening in the now, in the here and now. And how can we use some of those bottom-up approaches, both in person, but also via the internet. And I've been doing a lot of this work virtually, and I think it's really possible, including neurofeedback. How can we do this virtually to really help people through these incredibly difficult times?
That's great. Thank you. So just to answer a couple of sort of housekeeping questions, the course is recorded just as this is recorded. There are no CEs for today's live stream, but you can get CEs for the course even if you do not attend the live session. So for those of you in different time zones who are joining us at 3 o'clock in the morning where you are because you want to join this live stream, you won't have to do that to participate in this course and to get CEs. And then there, let's see there were also a couple of questions about so one of the things that we hear a lot in interacting with therapists, particularly therapists who come into the field with high hopes for addressing, deep-seated issues with, trauma and so on, is a sense of surprise that interacting with trauma therapists who work with neurofeedback and other bottom-up therapies, that there is actually a possibility of change in the person rather than simply managing or coping. And I think that's one of the most hopeful pieces of this. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Ruth, about clearly people want to come and say, well, how many sessions is it going to take for me to be, to be doing awesome? And that's not something that can be answered. But there is this sense that there is progress that can be made depending on a situation, right? In most cases. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that idea. The change for a therapist from a sense of like what I can offer is support and coping strategies for my clients and my patients. And for people who are actually survivors, all I can hope for is for things to be a little bit more tolerable, to a sense of like, by virtue of doing this therapy and these modalities, that we can get to a place where we're actually not feeling under threat, not responding in that kind of way on a day-to-day basis. Sorry, I went on.
Oh, absolutely, Dyson. I think that's such an important topic, and I think there's so much hope, even for the most significantly injured clients. And that's really what I've specialized in over the years. And I remember when I first started the clinic in London, Ontario, our clinic was a multidisciplinary clinic, and it specialized in the highest users of the mental health care system. And all these individuals had been basically written off by the system. And it was amazing to see, with this integrative trauma-informed approach, how people could really thrive and restore their sense of self and really increase their quality of life. I'm not saying that it's easy for therapists or for traumatized individuals. It's a hard road, it's arduous, and it takes a lot of persistence on the individual and the therapist. But I think if you persist and if you walk that really difficult road together, I think there's a lot of hope at the end of it. And so I always say to people, never give up. There's hope. And if one thing doesn't work, then we have to find another thing. And I think that's why we all need an integrative approach. We need as many therapeutic modalities at our hands as possible. And I think that's something that decreases significantly therapist burnout as well, so that we never run out of hope, that we kind of brainstorm what may be happening in the brain and in the body, and how can we figure this out, and what therapy may be most effective for this person at a particular time. And I've been so impressed with the individuals on this webinar, with how they approach therapy and how committed they are and how knowledgeable they are. And I think that really brings a lot of hope to the field and to our clients.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. There are a number of questions. As always, the quality of the questions is so high that it gets really difficult on the fly for me to make judgments about what to ask you. And I have this olive branch to offer, which is that if you have questions about stuff, please feel free to write to me at info@htslearn.com, and I will pass along those questions. We can get answers to those questions to you. And if you write to me and you want more information, this is what we are here for, is to do this stuff. Part of the reason why people like 𝗕𝗿 and Ruth and Donna Jackson-Nakazawa, who will be doing a webinar on inflammation and COVID coming up in March. We have alignment on wanting to get the word out about the neurophysiological basis for how these behavioral problems begin. And so, you know, any opportunity to kind of talk about that is a good one. I wonder, Ruth, as a sort of ending place, if you could talk a little bit about what it looks like to you looking forward in terms of trauma therapy and instructive. There's a lot of good conversation about sort of the difference between brain structures and the therapeutic relationship. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've seen that change, this attention to the importance of the therapeutic relationship and to the neurophysiology in the time that because you've been working at this for a while, as I understand.
Yeah, and that's a big field, of course, that is often talked about by Dan Siegel and Lou Pozzolino. And we know from Bruce Wampold how the therapeutic relationship is so important across therapies. And that probably quite a significant effect that we see from the different modalities are also based on the therapeutic relationship. And people who do a lot of treatment outcome studies also know how important it is to really have a good therapist administering whatever treatment it is. And so we know that the therapeutic relationship is at the core of any treatment. Of course, in people who have an early life trauma history where they're hurt at the hands of the caregivers, we can also be a trigger, and we need to be aware of that and how we can work around that. And that's something I've really learned from the COVID pandemic, that for some clients who are severely traumatized, working virtually decreases their level of hypervigilance, and I think allows the prefrontal cortex to be online more so they can process more. But whatever means of delivering therapy we use, I think the therapeutic relationship is at the core, and we really need to foster that in our clients.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us today, for doing this. If anyone has other questions about the details of the course that's going to be coming up or anything else, please feel free to get in touch with me. The course begins 3 p.m. Eastern, and you can sign up. I put the link in there. I'll put the link in the chat again, htslearn.com/TBR. That's Trauma, Balance, and Recovery is what the TBR stands for. Thank you everyone for joining us. This has been a really amazing experience. I have learned a lot today. I hope you all feel the same way.
Thank you, Lars, and nice to see everyone.
Thank you, Ruth.
Yeah, thank you.
Dankeschön. Dankeschön und gute Nacht.
Good night.
Thanks, Ruth
Take
and
care.
Lars and 𝗕𝗿.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Take care and stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Grazie e a presto.
Hi, Portia.